So I studied classics at Harvard and was very familiar with the decline of the empire of ancient Greece and Rome. And there you saw at the latter part of those empires characteristics that are intimately familiar to all of us within the American empire. So in essence, what happens, this is what Plato is lamenting when he writes the Republic, because remember, Plato writes the Republic after the death of Athenian democracy. And he writes the Republic. The Greeks, of course, have a very different notion of time, as do most Eastern cultures. They don't see time as lineal. They don't believe in the myth of human progress, that we are just improving and improving. Rather, its time is cyclical both for individuals and societies, so that you have a period of maturation, of growth, and then finally you complete the cycle and it comes back to decay. So that's why when Plato is writing the Republic, every mechanism that he proposes is about trying to freeze time because decay is inevitable, to stave off decay as much as possible. So what kills the Athenian democracy is the rise of the Athenian empire, because you need a central bureaucratic structure to maintain empire, which is unelected and undemocratic. And so the weakening of the polis, of the city-states, and that construction of empire gives rise to an oligarchic class which finally takes control. You have less and less say within your society. Thucydides writes about this when he says that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So what happens at the outer reaches of empire, we see it in our own empire: militarized police, wholesale surveillance, the suspension or eradication of civil liberties, militarized drones, all of those mechanisms that are first carried out against those who are being subjugated within empire eventually come back to the homeland, because your military, as ours is, I mean, half of our discretionary spending is now spent on the military, and our roads are crumbling, and 16 million children go to bed every night hungry, and you bring back those familiar forms of control to the homeland. The other characteristic, of course, is that when that cabal seizes power, you had the ruling families in ancient Rome, they're just trading power back and forth. You have the facade of the Republic. It creates a kind of licentiousness. There's essentially two rules. Matt Taibbi wrote a pretty good book about this called Divide, where he looked at the legal mechanisms that criminalize the poor and the mechanisms that essentially allow the elites, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, to carry out massive acts of financial fraud and orchestrate tax boycotts, which they've done, that there become two rules within the society. As Barbara Ehrenreich pointed out in her great book, Nickel and Dimed, nobody works harder than the poor in this country. And she describes being poor in this country as one long emergency. So the idea that working hard is somehow going to allow you to advance becomes a fiction. The other aspect of declining empire is that they actually, at the beginning of empire, use their military prowess judiciously, fairly judiciously. But at the end of empire, as you begin decay, they engage, historians call it micro-militarism, they carry out suicidal military fiascos. You saw the Soviet Union do this in Afghanistan. The Greeks, when they invaded Sicily, their entire fleet was sunk, most of their soldiers were killed, the empire disintegrates. You saw the British Empire on a slow decline after the end of World War I, then invades Egypt after Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal and has to retreat in humiliation. And of course, what kills the power of the empire is the pound sterling is dropped as the world's reserve currency, which will kill our empire. So essentially, it's mismanagement. You have elites that sever themselves from the rest of the country. They retreat into their version of the Forbidden City or Versailles. There was a writer for The New Yorker who said, the rich in this country don't live in America, they live in Richistan. I think Matt Taibbi called them stateless archipelagos, but that's right. And when you have an elite that is that divorced from the reality around them and yet have that concentration of power and wealth, then you accelerate the destruction of the system itself because there's no rational governance. So what's happened in the United States is a process that John Ralston Saul calls it the coup d'etat in slow motion. I don't always credit him, but I was giving a talk at the University of Toronto and suddenly noticed that he was seated in the front row. So, all writers are thieves, you know. Don't you know that joke about writers, like, you know, as John Ralston Saul said, the coup d'etat in slow motion, and then the second time it's, well, as someone said, the coup d'etat, and then the third time is, as I've always said. But we had, I mean, you know, it turns out that Eisenhower, of all people, was quite prophetic about where we were headed. Remember that the highest tax rates for the wealthiest individuals and corporations under the Eisenhower administration was 91%. I mean, people say, well, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to? I say, tax them. We're going to tax them at 91%, like we used to. And the other thing we're going to do is, we must do, is destroy the military machine in this country, which is the greatest enemy of democracy. There's no rational, was it yesterday, right? Was the 17th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan? I mean, this is our micro-militarism. The Taliban controls more territory in Afghanistan than when we went in. They do. And we've lost the war. American troops, they don't even want to go out with the Afghan army because half of them are Taliban. I was with the PKK once when I was covering the Middle East. This is the Kurdish separatist group. And I've been with a lot of rebel or insurgencies, and I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years, but I noticed not only were they well-equipped, it's because they were all running drugs out of Lebanon, so they had money, but they were really good. And so I was talking to the PKK commander, and he said, oh, no, we won't accept anyone into the rebel movement until they've done their 2 years military service in the Turkish army. So what happened is that we lost control of our government, we lost control of our economy, you know, and this isn't unique to the United States. Neoliberalism as an ideology essentially created this absurd notion that societies could advance themselves by kneeling before the dictates of the marketplace. This is popularized by figures like Thomas Friedman and others. It's an absolutely ridiculous political theory. It has no economic validity in the, you know, I don't know how many years of economic history. No society has benefited by allowing their oligarchic elite to become unregulated and uncontrolled and unfettered, but was peddled quite effectively by corporations beginning in the 1970s, reacting to the rise of movements in the 1960s.